Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion, The Weight They Carry, Managing the Impact of Moral Injury on First Responders and Other Public Safety Personnel. I'm Dr. Kathy Kamkar, clinical psychologist and associate professor, Temerty Faculty of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, University of Toronto. I would like to acknowledge first the land on which this panel discussion is being hosted. The Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, CIPSRT, is housed at the University of Regina, located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the ancestral lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. It's an honor to welcome you all to this panel discussion with our experts on a topic that is not only pertinent, but so significant in our society today: moral injury among our public safety personnel. Moral injury is a term once primarily associated with the military, has increasingly become recognized as an important concern within the public safety sector. It is a concept that delves into the ethical dimensions of the work carried out by those who dedicate their lives to protecting and serving our communities. Potentially morally injurious events, PMIE, can take various forms, including exposure to actions, inactions, or events that violate a person's beliefs of right and wrong, betrayal by a trusted person, leadership shortcomings, or organizational failures. So moral injury is this distressing psychological, behavioral, social, and sometimes spiritual aftermath of exposure to such events. It is about the wounds inflicted on the soul when individuals are exposed to situations that challenge their deeply held moral beliefs and values. So it is very important to recognize and address moral injury as part of this comprehensive moral health support for our public safety personnel. And we do know now that a growing body of research highlights the ways that frequent exposure to potentially psychologically traumatic events can negatively impact the mental health and well-being of our public safety personnel and contribute to the development of operational or post-traumatic stress injuries. Similarly, exposure to one or more potentially morally injurious events can result in moral injury that may be associated with mental health challenges. So this panel discussion will discuss the profound impacts of moral injury on our public safety personnel, as well as emergent guidelines for supporting and treating individuals negatively impacted by the moral weight of their service. It is with an immense pleasure that I would like to introduce you to our wonderful panelists. Dr. Suzette Bremont-Phillips, Professor, Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine within University of Alberta, as well as the Director of Heroes in Mind Advocacy and Research Consortium. Dr. David Malloy, President, King's University College at Western University. Dr. Liana Lenz, former police officer and a research associate, passionate about public safety personnel, bio, psycho, social, and spiritual wellness education. Dr. Margaret McKinnon, professor and associate chair, research, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences within McMaster University, as well as the research lead, mental health and addictions within the St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton. Dr. Lorraine Smith-McDonald, assistant professor and co-chair, Department of Psychotherapy and Spirituality, Stan Stevens College, University of Alberta. Dr. Nicholas Colton, professor of psychology, Department of Psychology within University of Regina, and of course, our scientific director of the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, CIPSRT. We're also happy to share that this panel discussion was inspired by the forthcoming Moral Injury Guide for public safety personnel and leaders, which is scheduled for release in May. Also, we wish you to know that throughout the course of this presentation, we invite you to place your questions in the Q&A box. We will try, of course, to get as many of questions as possible when we reach to our questions and answers segment. And you also have the option of asking your questions anonymously. Now, let's please start a great presentation.
Thank you with a great introduction, Katie. So we're happy today to introduce the Moral Injury Guide that Katie just spoke of that will be coming out next month. We created this guide to operationalize and clarify a definition of moral injury to better help those working on the front lines. So the work of our team comes from several researchers with expertise in different areas. Psychology, occupational therapy, leadership, spirituality, philosophy, and public health, who've all worked on the front lines as clinicians and public safety personnel. So the current guide was designed to inform organizational, team, and individual moral awareness, promote resilience, and to provide guidance for proactive efforts to protect the well-being of public safety personnel at risk of exposure to PMIEs or potentially morally injurious events, or PMIEs, as some of us call it. We hope the guide will help researchers to better understand and mitigate the impacts of these PMIEs. So part one of the guide provides information to explain the moral, ethical, and value landscape in which PSP engage and showcase these opportunities to explore the roles, responsibilities, and capacities of individuals and organizations with respect to PMIEs and moral injury. Part two presents a framework for organizations, leaders, and individuals, showing the impacts PMIEs may have on public safety personnel and what might be done to manage or mitigate the effects of these exposures. Next slide, please. And before we start, we'd also like to acknowledge that this new guide is building on knowledge of other researchers in the area. So it was inspired by moral stress amongst healthcare workers during COVID-19, a guide to moral injury released by Phoenix, Australia, Centre for Post-Traumatic Mental Health, and the Canadian Centre of Excellence for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder and Other Mental Health Conditions, which is now Atlas. We'd like to thank the authors of the original work for their contribution to the field of moral injury and for their permission to adapt their guide to fit public safety personnel. We'd also like to thank the Canadian Community of Practice for Moral Injury, particularly Stephanie Gould, Walter Callahan, Sarah Rodriguez, Bardu Husseini, Patrick Smith for reviewing and providing feedback on the document. We'd also like to thank those at Phoenix Center, particularly Andrea Phelps, for reviewing the document. Finally, we'd like to thank CIPSERT for their initiative and support for creating this guide to address the needs of public safety personnel, and to acknowledge CIHR for funding the Compromised Conscience Catalyst Grant, which generated much of the new public safety personnel moral injury knowledge in the current guide. Next slide, please. Dave.
Well, good morning, everyone. So my contribution to this team and in particular the guide was to give a bit of a landscape on morals, ethics, and values. And I think the first thing I want to say is these are not synonymous terms. And I think part of the problem is not only in this field, but actually everywhere where you talk about philosophical terms, there is a tendency to talk about something as moral, and they think it's ethical, and they think it's value-based. But these are three very different things. And again, it really depends on who the foundational work that you're basing this on. From our perspective, we were using as a theoretical, a philosophical foundation, going back to origins, Aristotle, and then later Aquinas, in the way we've divided these terms up. So very quickly, and I'd be happy to answer questions later on in the presentation if anyone has any. We're perceiving morals as being very broad, universal concepts seeking the good. So these are concepts that regardless of the individual, regardless of the organization, regardless of the culture, these are things that we fundamentally as humans innately believe. So, for example, the torture of a child is universally wrong, and no one would, in their heart of hearts, disagree with that statement. That would be a universal principle. Now, ethics, and we have very fundamental beliefs that are universal, and frankly, very few beliefs that are universal, because our cultural orientation guides us in different directions on how we interpret that. Ethics, on the other hand, are much more context specific. And in this conversation, this is really looking toward the ethics codes of organizational contexts. So these are very specific guidelines, they're very specific statements, but they are derived from these universal concepts. So morals are universal, ethics are much more specific, either based culturally or organizationally. Both morals and ethics are externally driven. So these are our guidelines of how we ought to live based on external criteria. This is where values differ. And I think there's a lot of confusion when we talk about ethics and values synonymously. Values are, they can be driven from organizational ethics, and they can be driven from morals, but values are created by the individual. Values, technically, a value is a concept, so it's something we make up, of the desirable with a motivating force. What that means is that our behaviors, our actual behaviors, not our intended behaviors, but our actual behaviors, are a function of what we value. So, for example, if I say I value exercise, but I don't exercise, it's not truly a value that I hold. My behavior is a reflection of my value. So as we go through our conversations today, I just want to emphasize that we've differentiated these. And also, in further conversations, you can see where there might be some breakdown from a leadership perspective in organizations where ethical codes or ethical statements may say one thing, but the values of the individuals in the organization, whether they're leaders or officers in the field, those values may differ, and that's where we have tension. And in some of the research that my colleagues and I have done, that's where you see the notion of betrayal, where organizational ethical statements are not reflected in actual behaviors of either leadership or members. So I think I'll stop there, but happy to answer any questions that anyone has later on in the presentation. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this translate to practically when we think about what is moral injury? And so moral injury describes this psychological, emotional, social, and spiritual harm or impairment that results from experiencing a violation of deeply held morals, ethics, or values. So moral injury arises from circumstances where a person does or fails to do something that violates their morals, ethics, or deeply held personal values. An MI can arise when a person feels betrayed or witnesses others behaving in ways perceived to be morally wrong. So if you go to the next slide, please. What we see is that these potentially morally injurious events, or what we're going to term PMIEs for simplicity for today, can really be broken down into three main boxes. And there's numerous PMIEs that are associated with public safety personnel and first responders, which my colleague Leanna will speak about in a moment. But if we think about it in terms of these three boxes, there is self-orientated moral transgressions. So this involves doing or failing to do something in line with your MVE framework. So that's morals, ethics, and values that Dave just spoke about. There's other orientated moral transgressions involving being exposed to an MEV transgression committed by someone else. And then betrayal, which is an MVE transgression committed by a trusted person or group of people. It's also important to note that there seems to be at least another three broad categories, which also include acute, chronic, and cumulative PMIEs. And so you can have a number of experiences of, let's say, betrayal or other oriented people. So it's not always necessarily just one event that causes challenges. It can be a variety of challenges. Different people also respond differently to the same PMIEs. And so whether someone becomes morally injured or not seems to be dependent on at least 5 elements. The first is the number, level, and intensity of that PMIE exposure. The second is the role played by the person regarding the PMIE. The third is the perceived agency that the person has regarding the PMIE. The fourth is the perception the person has of their own morals, ethics, and values. And 5, which is most important, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is the possibility to repair the violation that has occurred. And over to you, Leanna. Next slide.
Thanks, Lorraine. So looking specifically at PMIE and first responders, so a subsection of public safety personnel, primarily firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and communicators. What recent research, some of our research and some research from Sarah Rodriguez indicates that there's some slightly different PMIEs that first responders experience compared to perhaps some other PSP groups. So what we noticed is a broad theme related to frustrated moral expectations. And generally within this, subrooted in this theme, there's 4 sub-themes. So creating unrealistic expectations. Coming out of training or group training, first responders are generally prepared to respond to those like challenging, exciting, dynamic incidents. However, we find that first responders experience occupational events that are either continually unresolved and unresolvable, or that are mundane, common, ridiculous, and even impossible, which can lead to frustration and feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. The second, trying to do good, it relates similarly to not being able to help, which is the primary reason that most first responders go into their careers, is the desire to help the community. So when you're continually revisiting maybe the same people, the same types of incidents, and not being able to have an effect, then this can have some negative effect on your being as well. So finally, to minimize and manage frustration, often PSP will shove their feelings down and use avoidance strategies for fear of reprisals from being honest or vulnerable about mental health, and perhaps being seen as weak or different compared to other people in their work cohort. Another strategy is through moral compromise, where one creates cognitive and emotional space within their person and their original moral imperative. So if any of you know first responders and knew them prior to becoming a first responder, you may notice that they have some sort of a change, which is commonly talked about within the community. This is where their thoughts may turn more to where the world is terrible or anything they do is in vain, which can materialize in annoyance, skepticism, dismissiveness, numbness, anger, bitterness, aggressiveness, and being judgmental. So maybe the salty old policewoman might be like that, or us younger ones too. Finally, finding resolution to the moral suffering or frustration can result in escape behaviors, which can range from changing work areas to leaving the profession or dying by suicide. Next slide, please. All right.
Thank you, Leanna. Thank you for sharing those. So now that we have a sense of some of the PMIEs that first responders and PSP experience, I think it's important to talk about how moral injury can occur. And this is our understanding, and this is a growing understanding. So we just want to share that this is how we've come to understand this idea. So the first thing is that we have this person and we have this PSP. And it's important to note that all PSP come with their own unique sets of traits, personalities, histories, and so on. And so not everyone who's exposed to PMIEs will necessarily experience a moral injury. However, when you take a certain person and you chronically expose them to PMIEs, the likelihood is that they will begin to experience a moral injury. Once they begin to experience that moral injury, which for us is really that breaking, that experience of, again, going back to those three categories, that sense of transgression against self, against others, or betrayal, most people then begin to experience moral injury symptoms. And these symptoms can be a variety of symptoms, as illustrated by Leanna, whether that's emotional in terms of hopelessness, jadedness, cynicism, psychological in terms of intrusive thoughts, ruminations, and so on. People can then begin to cycle between these two categories. And so it's really, again, important to note that what we're finding in PSP is this chronic cumulative component. And so many people will then go through these categories of going through a PMIE, experiencing that moral injury, then beginning to experience moral injury symptoms, and then loop back around against themselves. And so this can obviously then cause some significant difficulties. When we look at the outcomes that people can experience from moral injury, there's really two broad categories, which we've termed to be negative and also positive. On the negative, it's quite possible that people begin to experience both PTSIs or post-traumatic stress injuries, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, or generalized anxiety disorder. And that moral injury fits often within those categories and overlaps with a lot of these mental health diagnoses. On the more positive side, I think it's also important to note that persons can also experience positive outcomes, such as moral growth or moral resiliency. And so it's not necessarily a detrimental component when you experience a moral injury. It's really about your ability to manage, to integrate, and to heal from that moral injury that will very much direct whether you go one way or the other. All right, back to you, Leanna. Oh, actually, sorry, I have another slide, pardon me. All right, if you can move to the next slide. We also just want to make a small note about the difference between moral injury and something like PTSD. Although there's often many times where they overlap each other, it's important to note that, again, it really depends on the nature of the exposure that makes the difference. So with PTSD, it's exposure to substantial threat of physical harm to oneself or one others. Well, in moral injury, it's an exposure to transgressions of morals, ethics, or values. And again, this difference between a PMIE and a PPTE. We also want to note that currently moral injury is not a clinical diagnosis where something like PTSD is. And we can answer more questions about this idea of moral injury as a clinical diagnosis as we go along. Okay, now back to you, Leanna.
Thanks, Lorraine. So the frequent PMIE exposures that PSP experience, along with the behavior and emotional changes, can also prompt changes in their values during the career. So experiences that are common to public safety personnel are uncommon to members of the general public, with death, violence, antisocial behaviors, etc. So changes in morals, ethics, and values for public safety personnel may be normal and adaptive. However, PSP who are not properly prepared with the skills and capacities to manage the PMIE exposures may develop decreased abilities to adapt in a positive way, as Lorraine said, to work in both different directions. So, as coined by Amy Edmondson, a psychologically safe workplace exists when the people involved hold a shared belief that the workplace or team is supported in interpersonal risk-taking, and employees can voice their opinions or concerns without fear of embarrassment, rejection, or punishment. So when we're taking into consideration management of moral injury in the workplace, it's important to note that the cumulative impacts of PMIE exposures can be mitigated in several ways, including but not limited to supporting empathetic leaders who are identified as such during the promotional process. So looking before people become leaders or managers and identifying people who might have these skills. identifying positive role models and mental health champions within the organization, encouraging supportive teams that can receive demonstrable appreciation from all levels of the organization, encouraging camaraderie by allowing for team building activities, promoting feelings of effectiveness and pride when overcoming adversities, and perhaps allowing for decompression time between expressors. But we also realize reality and the difficulty that may have, but it's important to consider that this may be something that can be integrated. Next slide, please. Now for leaders, it's important for leadership to establish organizational frameworks for managing PMI's exposures and moral injury in the workplace. The ethical culture of any organization is ultimately a key responsibility that falls on leaders, specifically to foster ethically consistent, psychologically safe, and values-based workplaces. Leaders can support ethical cultures by implementing proactive approaches that reduce risk, maximize resilience, and provide early and accessible care for moral injury. Longer-term strategies may involve additional training, with periodic training associated with organizational personal ethics awareness, expanded occupational resources, like ensuring sufficient staffing levels and equipment to meet the workload and expectations, and exploring management processes, like rotating of staff between high and low stress roles, decompression time, transition time, and maybe enabling flexible schedules when possible. All right, next to you.
Great. So when we think about the consideration for teams to manage and mitigate PMIs, we're talking about a few different things. So military-based research supports the ideas that individuals who are part of cohesive units with high morale may have fewer mental health challenges. So cohesive teams with high morale may be psychologically safe environments that are better able to mitigate the impact of PMIs on their members. So support of open communication, cohesion, and morale, while also having dedicated and transparent discussions about PMIs, may also be incredibly important. This may be particularly relevant when we look at the challenges that PSP have had to go through, whether that's the addiction crisis or COVID-19. So being able to acknowledge the challenges that PSP are experiencing and being able to have that open communication. Leaders can also promote team cohesion and positive mental health support through obtaining their own training, modeling and facilitating positive coping skills, and by encouraging employees to seek out peer and professional support, which is something we'll talk more about in the question period. Next slide, please. So finally, what can individuals do? And this is an important component because we recognize that there needs to be both organizational, team, and leadership changes, but also individuals can also do a variety of activities to support themselves to address and mitigate PMIs. So some of the examples that we've come up with include things like work to understand your own morals, ethics, and values so that you can better understand yourself and your role as a PSP. This way you can also monitor your own experiences and begin to see if are you, as Leanna said, having this shift of your morals, ethics, and values as you go along during your career as a PSP. Reflect on aspects of your service that provide your life with meaning. So why did you get into the organization? What is a meaningful activity for you in this organization? And engage in meaningful activities that you find rejuvenating, such as making regular use of activities that reduce your stress, such as relaxation, mindfulness, and exercise, making regular use of self-care activities, engaging in self-reflective and spiritual practices that fit with you and your values to help acknowledge and process the impact that PMIs may have on you, and most importantly, to seek professional support early if you're feeling bothered or distressed by your experiences. Next slide, please. Back to you, Leanna.
Thank you. And so finally, we talk about formal and informal supports, and it's important to recognize that those who are close to public safety personnel, whether it's friends, family, co-workers even, might have insight into changes in behaviors that might indicate an occupational stress injury or moral injury, And certainly families can be an important source of support and meaning following a PMIE exposure. So what formal and informal supporters can do is learn about PMIEs and moral injury and what they can use to identify if their friend, family member is experiencing some effects from PMIEs. Should be curious and open to exploring whether PSP presenting with distress and impairment may be reacting to a PMIE, experience at MI or some other psychologically traumatic event. Mental health professionals can develop assessment skills and learn evidence-informed interventions and then progress to evidence-based interventions, because the exposures are different in moral injury and PTSD, for example, and the approach health care professionals may take in treating someone with a moral injury may differ as well. Engaging in spiritual, religious, or faith leaders as appropriate to provide holistic care, and encouraging public safety personnel to engage in meaningful and pleasurable activities or hobbies outside of their work, like Lorraine mentioned previously. So this is the conclusion of our introduction to our moral injury guide. So now if there are any questions that we have, we're happy to discuss those and open our discussion panel.
Thank you so much for this enlightening presentation. And again, a gentle reminder that we invite all of you to pose your questions within our Q&A box. And we are going to pose now our first question from the audience, and it's a great one. And the question is as follows. Can Dr. Malloy speak to the nuance of using the words concepts versus laws and principles, as the slide presents universal laws, but he spoke universal concepts when presenting it and added principles afterwards in explaining further?
Yes, I apologize for the confusion. So I'll go back to Aristotle. So morals would describe universal laws or principles. He would describe universal principles, I think, because these are, he and Aquinas would argue that these are innate principles that we hold within ourselves. So we may not explicitly understand why we would be reacting to certain negative events the way we do, but these are innate as human beings. These are innate reactions to a wrong. So I think if we said laws, I think that would be more appropriate to be speaking about ethics, because it's more context and societally driven. I think it's more appropriate to talk about morals as moral principles, because they are, as I mentioned, they are more implicit notions than would an explicit law. Don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you so very much. We're going to move now to our second question from the audience, another great one. I don't see a focus on the importance of peer-to-peer support. Is that included in the moral injury guide?
Oops, sorry, I was muted. I can take that one. And definitely we do speak to that. And I think that was an oversight in our presentation in terms of that formal and informal support that Leanna was speaking about. We definitely recognize that peer support is a huge component because of the importance that your peers may have either just gone through that experience with you or may have similar experiences, and therefore may be able to really resonate with you in a way that other sort of formal, whether that's healthcare providers or also just your family members, might not be able to do that. I think the only caveat that we have in terms of peer support is making sure that it is a safe place to be able to do that work in terms of exploring the PMIE and maybe even your moral injury. Obviously, when we're talking about a transgression of someone's morals, ethics, or values, it's very sensitive. It's very personal, as Dave said. It really can challenge who we are, the things that we hold to be important. And so it is important that that is truly a safe space to be able to have that conversation. But definitely peer support is a big component and something that we're definitely looking into. My lovely colleagues, would you like to add anything to that?
I think I'd just like to add briefly too, like Lorraine, you were saying, it's a very personal type of experience or injury, and that's maybe something for peer supporters to be aware of is often people who have a moral injury can have feelings of severe guilt and shame, which also makes it more difficult to come forward and speak about it because it really speaks to their person. So that's important, I think, to keep in mind as well for peer supporters.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next great question from the audience. I'm wondering what assessment tools you use to measure moral injury. For example, do you incorporate the SDAT, Spiritual Distress Assessment Tool, often used by spiritual care staff and chaplains? I'm also wondering how you have engaged research around spiritual care and chaplaincy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to maybe look to our team here again. I can maybe take a first stab, and then maybe Suzette, would you like to follow up with that? And then Margaret and Nick, if you wanted to as well.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think what we know is that moral injury can often present with a type of spiritual distress. It can really challenge, obviously a person's world-orienting view, their moral framework, their values framework. It can really challenge their sense of meaning and purpose, their relationality, whether that's with themselves, with others, if they believe in it, a higher power. And that there's good research to show that spiritual distress can also help to drive the negative symptomology that people experience with moral injury. So if someone's spiritual distress is not being resolved, it is quite likely that that is going to impact their moral injury until that spiritual distress is resolved. And so definitely working with spiritual care professionals, chaplains, can be very helpful with that. We look at something like the Canadian Armed Forces. We did a study looking at the role of mental health chaplains and that bridging that they can often do as well between taking that person from that initial distress and helping to support them to address not only the spiritual distress, but also then bridge them into formal mental health care can be a really powerful component. So I'm going to leave it there. And then Suzette, would you like to take over? And then Margaret?
Yeah, I think that there's further to what you said, Lorraine, just taking a holistic approach and allowing people to understand what the moral injury is and exploring what its root is. It's important to distill out the different kinds or manifestations of the moral injury and assess that, and then be able to bridge into whether that overlaps with some of the mental health considerations that need to be made. So I think that space of figuring out what the assessing, utilizing some different tools. I put in the chat a recent publication that just came out on measuring spiritual distress and moral injury, a systematic review and content analysis of existing scales so that people could take a look there, which has been published by a number of our colleagues across Canada and beyond. So distilling that out and being able to understand the source of it and look at where there's an overlap to normalize the experience where someone is experiencing an abnormal or a normal response to an abnormal situation, and helping them through a variety of different means to be able to, through peer support, through formal supports, through whatever supports might be appropriate for them formally and informally, to resolve it. Margaret, do you want to take it from there?
Sure, and I'll also comment very briefly. We did look at the mental health and well-being of public safety personnel across the country over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we actually looked at factors that either increased or decreased the likelihood of experiencing a moral injury. And there were two factors in a recent study that we're just about to submit for publication. And one was, in fact, having spirituality or having a sense of peace or faith in one's life was actually associated with a reduction in moral injury. That was very interesting to us. And it really suggests that, there are a number of different approaches to caring for someone with a moral injury, but it may be is to that, and Lorraine are saying that for individuals who feel this is appropriate and where this is part of their lives, chaplaincy or a spiritual approach may in fact be quite important for a number of individuals, including the PSP community. So not advocating for one approach or another, but simply noting that that was a factor that was associated with a decrease in moral injury. The other factor that was heavily associated with a reduction in moral injury among public safety personnel across the country was the presence of strong organizational support. And I think all of the speakers today have addressed that, and having a sense that your organization cares for you and has your back really does make a very big difference in terms of reducing moral injury among public safety personnel and also healthcare workers as well. We've had similar findings in healthcare workers.
Thank you very much. Another great question again from our audience, and again, it's around therapy and intervention related. What are the most effective therapeutic interventions currently being used or showing the most promise for the treatment of moral injury?
I mean, if I may, I saw a question below asking about what action could an organization do to operationalize safety? And I just want to comment that really understanding the the concept of moral injury tends to be very helpful for people. So, during the pandemic, I often would go onto COVID-19 units or give talks to different professional organizations, including public safety personnel. And oftentimes hearing the concept moral injury actually gave people words for their experience. They said, I was really struggling with this, but I didn't have the words to describe it. I often felt that I was alone and feeling shame or guilt or a deep sense of anger and betrayal. But when I'm sitting here listening to this talk about moral injury, it's helping me to not feel alone. I think also having events like this, which increase our understanding around moral injury, gives us words to speak to one another, right? And I think it goes beyond those simple words of moral injury to feelings of guilt and shame. But also, we really saw this during the pandemic, especially with a sense of betrayal, right? So people felt either hurt, they might have felt ashamed, they might have felt that their organization didn't have their back, or the government, for whatever reason, didn't have enough PPE available, there wasn't enough training available. We heard from public safety personnel who said, in the time that it took me to put on my PPE, because I had to, someone may have lost their life while we were getting ready to go in to a call. And, these are difficult, they're really difficult things to face. It includes, having to restrict visitors, having to enforce regulations that one may or may not agree with, tension around vaccine masking within different stations and halls. But I think ultimately having knowledge of the concept of moral injury is really, really powerful in helping people not to feel alone and having words to talk about this. So I just wanted to address that as one. I think that's one very effective thing that organizations can do. It's really to increase understanding and awareness around this concept. It helps a lot. I really believe that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. McKinnon. And eventually they also address as part of therapy sessions as well, that self-awareness and education. Thank you. We have another great question, actually. Are moral injuries going to become its own diagnosis, or will it be included in another mental health diagnosis?
May I comment? I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep jumping in. I apologize. This is the last time I'll comment. I'm just going to say this. I think what's really important about moral injury is that it can occur across mental health conditions, right? So you can experience a moral injury if you're facing depression, anxiety, a post-traumatic stress injury. It's not something that occurs only with PTSIs. And I think that really speaks to how we need to assess people regardless of what the mental health difficulty is for moral injury. I think that's incredibly important. And if we, in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for the clinicians in the audience, I would really consider that a specifier. So much like with PTSD, we say the dissociative or non-dissociative subtype of PTSD. I think it would be incredibly helpful when we look at mental health conditions to say with or without moral injury, particularly among service personnel, like public safety personnel.
Thank you.
And
Another great one.
regarding the
Go ahead.
question about moral injury becoming a diagnosis, this is something we've discussed in our group quite a bit. But I'd like to put that over to one of the clinicians, and something that Nick is pretty passionate about, I think.
Dr. Colton.
Sure. I agree with what Dr. McKinnon said. We don't have a moral injury disorder right now. I dropped into the typed chat a long answer. The short answer is we don't have a moral injury disorder. We might in the future, but we don't need one in order to provide someone with a diagnosis that can lead to treatment.
Yeah.
Just like a PTSI can lead to post-traumatic stress. This is exactly what Dr. McKinnon was saying, can lead to a diagnosis of PTSD or major depressive disorder. We can also have a moral injury that could be consistent with a diagnosis of PTSD or major depressive disorder. So you put the specifier on there so the clinicians know better how to try and engage with the symptoms. We might have one in the future, but that's a to be decided thing.
Absolutely.
If I can add to that too, Nick and Margaret, I think with the specifier, it allows us, and thinking about it as you've named it, Margaret, across the multiple different kinds of diagnosis, but then it opens the door to a variety of different kinds of interventions too, within diagnosed conditions and also outside of it. So going back to another question, previous question, looking at where the diagnosis is and then what kinds of treatments approaches there are, that for some individuals, utilizing a cognitive behavioral approach or an exposure-based approach might work. A brief exposure-based approach, ADT, ACT may be appropriate. For some, utilizing ACT for MI or what we're calling AMPS might be appropriate. For others, it might be that we try some novel and emerging interventions, for example, accelerated resolution therapy, or these emerging ones that are yet to be fully endorsed and evidence behind them fully, but 3MDR, virtual reality supported psychotherapy, we're finding some good effects with that with moral injury. But when we broaden out the added as a specifier, then it opens up the space for a person-centered approach to what might be appropriate for a particular individual. And for some, it might not be a formal mental health approach. It might be that that utilizing social supports within the community or peer supports to help them better connect where they're feeling quite isolated. So in that way, there's a continuum of how moral injury might impact someone, and looking at it that way to see what kind of degree or extent of therapy might be warranted or needed, and also some of the complexities that can come with that across other comorbidities and multiple diagnoses or diagnostic criteria that it might fit within. Margaret, you have your hand up.
Yeah, only in one sentence, just to say I completely agree with you, so that about the exploration of multiple approaches. It's very clear though that we need to remember that there's exposure to a morally injurious event, so that could be exposure to an event that challenged your moral or ethical beliefs. It does not necessarily mean people go on to incur the injury, right? So the injury is what follows for some people and not all people, right? So some may experience moral distress, which is quite healthy and normal, and some may go on to experience a moral injury associated with the guilt, shame, betrayal, onset of mental health conditions, and so on. So I think it's always really important for us to, just as you were saying, so that just as you said, to really frame it within that context.
I think too, to also look at where sometimes it's the moral injury underneath some of these other conditions that might be holding back someone from being able to progress through the course of the recovery. So the importance of being able to recognize it, name it, assess it, look at the appropriate type of intervention that would be agreeable to the individual to be able to help them overcome some of that shame, guilt, sense of betrayal, and help them reconnect with themselves, with others, and with that which is beyond themselves for those who have that perspective.
And I think I'd go back to what Margaret was talking to, is that like part of the big reason why we're here and we have the guide is to kind of try and prevent moral injury or mitigate the effects of exposure to PMIEs, to mitigate the exposure and what the effect they might have on first responders. I think that's the key thing with the guide. That's where I come from. I'm not a clinician. I'm an injury prevention specialist. So I think that's an important thing to keep in context with part of our discussions today as well. But that not everyone's going to get a moral injury. You may have symptoms of a moral injury, just like you might for other occupational stress disorders. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a moral injury that's going to interfere with your abilities to do things from day to day. So
I think that brings
Yeah.
up something, Lorena or Leanna, across a continuum of different kinds of interventions, from looking at how we can prepare people as they're going into service. So scenario-based training, for example, that includes morals, ethics, and values, and exposing people to different situations or having them pre-think through that. There's also other interventions across the continuum, depending on how severe those symptoms might be and what might be warranted. So it opens up a raft of different kinds of interventions. I don't know if I want to speak with that. I also know Dave had a sample.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Suzette. I think that's really important that, of course, we're talking about, methodologies and therapies once someone has a moral injury, but I think we really need to think seriously about what we can do as a preventative measure. And I think that involves individuals really doing value audits of themselves. And I think organizations doing value audits to find out what they really authentically believe and how they really intend to act, rather than just assuming that people are equipped with their self-knowledge of what their values are. I think many of us don't take the time or don't know how to ask ourselves those kinds of questions. So preparedness for moral injury or moral stress is, I think, also equally important.
If I may just comment on two pieces of research that we did in our lab. One was that we asked public safety personnel who were receiving inpatient treatment at Homewood, what are the unique aspects of mental health difficulties among public safety personnel? And there was many people, just to say, said moral injury. They really felt this is a part of what public safety personnel experience. Sophia Roth, who was a student in my lab, also looked at, it's not just what we're experiencing in the present moment, it's also what we've experienced in the past, right? And how that guides our responses to things happening right now. And so when Sophia looked at this in public safety personnel, they found rather that when people who have a history of childhood abuse or trauma may be more vulnerable to moral injury as public safety personnel and also as military members. So, when you've been taught as a child, for example, that you're dirty, you're shameful, you're not worthy, you can reenact those same feelings when you're experiencing that during adult life. So it's really important to think about the past in relation to this. But what Sophia also found was that when we were able to identify our emotions, so to say, I think I am experiencing some guilt right now, some shame, I am feeling betrayed. That ability to recognize emotions was actually helped to protect people despite having a history of childhood abuse. So I think really working on awareness and understanding is a really important way, again, of addressing moral injury.
I think with that too, being able to know how to process that and to be able to shift one's
Absolutely.
perspective, so that flexibility of thinking and appreciating other ways of being, and the emotional regulation that comes with that,
Absolutely.
and then learning how
Yeah.
to work through those things, important pieces. Because it cuts down, there's something about moral injury that cuts down to one's very core in identity. And if that sense of identity and attachment and connection is fragile, then it makes it more, then those things need to be repaired and strengthened so that someone can then move on and be able to accept and embrace who they are, and also separate it from what they may have done or what they may have seen, or what, to separate the doing from the being, and be able to embrace the goodness of who they are.
Yep. Like I agree with that. And if we think about anger as a secondary emotion, there's often something else
Absolutely.
driving it, right? So is that a sense of hurt, for example? So I feel hurt that my organization didn't support me. That hurt reminds me of something in the past, for example, that hurt me. And so I'm re-experiencing that now. I think there's a lot of work that could be done. As you say, that there's so much in this area that's so important to explore.
Yeah.
Oh.
A lot of it needs to be explored, and then a lot of it needs to be recognized in the awareness, and then applying a variety of tools. And I think, there's so many tools people can do on their own, and then the organizational component and the relational component, everything from self-acceptance and journaling that people can do, to connecting and hearing themselves, doing value audits on the individual level, but those imperative pieces of community, connection, organizational leadership. But Katie has a thought.
So speaking in regards to that, because this is very important and this has really gathered a lot of interest among our audience, the question is really, what are the most effective therapeutic interventions currently being used or showing the most promise for the treatment of moral injury? And we have less than 4 minutes left.
I mean, I think there are a number of things out there that Sue that sort of went through and discussed, but I want to really encourage us to think about those therapies, but also to think about what comes next as well, right? And I think there's often a belief that we have to focus on thoughts to help with recovery and emotions, but we have to also remember that part of moral injury is also our bodies, right? So with Ruth Lanius, we scanned the brains of public safety personnel as they remembered a morally injurious event. And they would say that feels like having a kick in the stomach, right? When you recollect something that was, really, that gave you a sense of guilt or shame, you felt that sense in your gut that this was wrong, right? And what we found in those studies was that areas of the brain associated with disgust, associated with vomiting or nausea, areas of the brain associated with monitoring, shame, those areas of the brain lit up during recollection of these events. So I think when we think about targeting moral injury, let's remember to think not only about trying to change thoughts, but also how do we help our body to be in an optimal zone of arousal, to not be re-experiencing that sense of the gut and being punched in the gut when remembering this, right? And that can be things like, using sensory objects to help ground yourself. Grounding is a very important tool in post-traumatic stress injuries. It could be mindfulness that's been adjusted for trauma, because remembering that trauma can also, when we have to be present in our bodies, it can be difficult with a history of trauma, but there are ways of doing that to modify for trauma. Mindfulness, so that uses 3MDR, which involves movement. So just remembering, especially for people who, have a preference, not necessarily for talking about this, but for doing, we can use our bodies as well to help us to get through these injuries as well. Yoga is another way that's been shown to be quite effective in PTSD in some populations.
Thank you so very much. Well, many thanks to our great panelists for delivering such an important presentation and discussion, and of course to all of you who have joined us in the audience today. Your engagement with this topic has created, as we have seen, such a meaningful dialogue this morning, and speaks once again to what a crucial conversation this is. Also, great news to share. CIPSRD invites you to save the date for its upcoming conference, Thriving in Public Safety, Research to Action. It will be held in Regina, Saskatchewan from May 6th to May 8th, 2025. So again, placing it on our calendar, May 6th to May 8th, 2025. And please watch the CIPSRD website and social media channels for details to be released as they become available. Thank you so much again.